Good afternoon, classmate. Now I discuss to you about task designing. What is task designing? In designing a task, the learning tasks need to be well planned. And as a teacher, you are not just designing a learning task or designing just for the sake of doing so. It really has to be well taught. In particular, the teacher must ensure that the particular learning process to be observed contribute overall understanding of the subject of course. So, after knowing what is task designing is, now hear the list of accepted standards of designing a task. Letter A. Identifying an activity that would highlight the competencies to be evaluated. Example, a poem, writing an essay, and manipulating the microscope, etc. So here the activities should be focused on the knowledge and skill that the teacher wants to convey, what competencies you want to be observed or evaluate to your students. Let's say cooking or solving a problem. Letter B is identifying an activity that would entail or more or less the same sets of competencies. If an activity would have difficulty assessing the student's competency on task. So let's say you want to observe your student to compose or make a poem. So just focus on that competencies, let's say the choice of words, the grammar, influency of thought, and etc. But do not mix that with other competencies. Let's say you want to dramatize or sing their poem, that would be another task from them to do. And the last is finding a task that would be interesting and enjoyable for the students. Tasks such as writing an essay are often boring and cumbersome of the students. So, those tasks that are appealing or into their taste, like example, they can do TikTok or debates as long as it is goal-based or aligned to the learning objectives. So now, let's proceed in scoring rubrics. Let me first define what is scoring rubrics. Rubric is scoring the scale need to assess student performance along a task-specific set of criteria. So, the student's aptitude on a task is determined by matching the student's performance against a set of criteria to determine the degree of which the student's performance meets the criteria for the task. So it is the standard or a set of expectations that the teacher have in connection to the task given, which is the basic of categorizing of the student's performance or response to the task. Why do we use rubrics to help teachers? 1. Make scoring easier for performance tasks. So the teacher can guess the student's score. That's what they need to use rubrics. Second, ensures scoring reliability across multiple students. So there is consistency in scoring of each student. Last, provide feedback and accountability to students. Of course, teacher can tell the students that he or she needs to develop or focus on this particular area or aspect. And to others who did very good in this area, they need to keep up with their good work so that the students will be motivated and encouraged to do their test. And also, we use rubrics for students to be able to see criteria for success, see strengths and weaknesses, receive meaningful feedback, and understand their score to students. So there would be less complaints to the student as well as from their parents. So here is the example of rubrics. So as you can see, a rubrics is comprised of three components: the criteria, the level of performance, and the descriptors. So let us define what is criteria. When you say criteria, these are characteristics of good performance in the task. So when we say criteria, it shows in what aspects students will be graded. It also states what factors we will look for in the performance of our students. And when we say level of performance, determine to what degree the student has met the criterion. So now let's proceed with the descriptors. When we say descriptors, a common component of rubrics spell out what is expected of students at each level of performance, looks like at each level, and how their work may be distinguished from the work of others for each criterion. Second, tell students precisely what performance look like at each level and how their work may be distinguished from the work of others. Last, it helps the teacher to precisely and consistently distinguish between student work. So that it's what we call descriptors. What is specific expectation for the performance of our student in its criterion. So here describes or defines the quality of performance demonstrated by students on each criteria or components. Why should levels of performance be included? 1. Clear expectations. It is very useful for the students and the teacher if the criteria are identified and communicated prior to completion of the task. Students know what is expected of them, and teachers know what to look for in students' performance. 2. More consistent and objective assessment. So, in addition to better communicating, teachers' expectation level of performance met the teacher more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance when evaluating students' work. Last is better feedback. Identifying specific level of students' performance allows the teacher to provide more detailed feedback to students. The teacher and the students can more clearly recognize areas that need to improvement. So let's proceed the word analytic and holistic rubrics. When we say analytic rubrics, articulate levels can assess students' performance on each criterion. It examines the different dimensions of performance. Using an analytic rubric, the teacher assists in more detail the performance of the students based on specific criteria and scale. So here is the example of analytic rubrics. So when we say holistic rubrics, it does not list a separate level of performance for each criterion. Instead, as a size of a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole, it is an assessment tool which assesses the performance or output of students in general aspects. This is the example of holistic rubric. When do we use each kind of rubrics? Analytic rubrics, most commonly used for assessing each criterion separately, particularly for assignments that involves larger number of criteria, and also analytic rubric is particularly useful for problem solving or application assessment because a rubric can list different categories for each component of the assessment that needs to be included, thereby accounting for the complexity of the task. Holistic rubric when a guide or gross judgment needs to be made. The holistic rubric is the most commonly used if the assessment is the minor one, so such a brief homework assignment, it may be sufficient to apply a holistic judgment to quickly review the student's works.